Okay, I think the webinar is now live. We're now live. I want to welcome everybody today for today's panels put on by the Collective of Radical Death Studies. My name is Dr. Tamara Warashinsky. I am the Director of Communications and also the Chair of Education and Outreach Committee. I am here together with Dr. Adam Rosenblatt, who is the co-moderator of this panel. He is Associate Professor of the Practice in International Comparative Studies at UG, and he's also part of the collective as chair of our Curriculum and Development Committee. Today's panel is called Disasters, Violence, and Recovering Bodies, and we have like an incredible lineup of experts in this area. However, somebody, Davet Gaddison, is unable to participate today. She is the forensic coordinator for the South Caucasus under the forensic unit of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And today she was just called into, to attend to a humanitarian crisis in the Armenian and Azerbaijan border. So she's unfortunately unable to be here with us. I think we want to kick this panel off by a short introduction. It would be great if the panelists could introduce themselves, say their titles, their affiliations or organizations they're working with, the areas of your expertise, as well as the research you're doing or the work you're doing. And I think let's start with Lucy Easthope, and then we want to go on to Angela Solar, and then last but not least, Jamie Lee Kim. So I'm going to hand over to you, Lucy. Thank you. Yeah, there you are.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am a professor at the University of Durham here in the northeast of England at what's called the After Disaster Network, which I founded to try and create a home for all of these, which is the recovery lessons from so many UK and international disasters. We have a political collective here in the UK with a very short memory, so I've made it my life's work to try and remind them noisily and quite passionately of all the lessons that we learned before. I think my proudest affiliation is the Centre for Death and Society at the University of Bath, where I have a research fellowship. And many years ago now, 2009, I think, they made me their research fellow in mass fatalities and pandemics. And I was reflecting a lot on this morning, because did I really think I'd never see one? Did I put in all of that work because I was never going to live through it? Part of me doesn't believe that I did. I must have known it was coming. So that was always like, the funny conference title, the research fellow in the deaths of pandemics. But this is what we've planned for and trained for. So that's a very interesting part of my career journey, really, I think. I'm a emeritus fellow of the UK's Emergency Planning Society, which is feeling quite under-listened to at the moment, as I think friends in the US have similar experience. And I'm a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute for my work supporting and understanding anthropologists in this area. As Professor Rosenblatt knows well, I'm a complete fangirl of all things forensic anthropology. And for me, they're the discipline and the specialism that get right the most, the balance between the care of the dead, the forensic requirements, and the clarification and understanding of what it is to be human. So that was a kind of natural home for me. So that's me. And I look forward to, in a moment, talking to you a bit more about my work.
All right, I guess I can just jump in then and introduce myself. I'm Dr. Angela Soler. I'm a board certified forensic anthropologist with the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner. I've been there about 5.5 years, and prior to that, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in Tucson, Arizona. Just to kind of give a little bit of background on what is forensic anthropology, since we'll be talking about our work. For those who aren't familiar with it, basically we are specialists in the recovery and analysis of human remains. Our expertise focuses on the human skeleton, but we are involved in a wide variety of casework. It's not just skeletal remains. We might be called in to help search and recover an individual. We might be called in to do a trauma analysis or interpret pathology of the bone. And then our big thing is also helping determine the identity of an unknown decedent. So we can basically look at the skeleton and help figure out whether somebody was approximately how old they were, approximately how tall they were, whether they were biologically male or female, and if they have, characteristics of different ancestral backgrounds. Aside from also working on human remains, many of us in forensic anthropology, as Lucy touched on, also work with families. So we do have that kind of broader anthropological background. And while difficult to balance at times, working on the remains and then also working with families really gives you a great respect for what you're doing, so that when you're analyzing a human body, to you, it's not just a human body, it's somebody's loved one. And carrying that through your casework is very important in how we serve families and how we serve communities. Through my work in both New York City and Tucson, you come into contact with people from a variety of backgrounds, but I think generally and overwhelmingly, a lot of individuals who come through the medical examiner system do tend to be from more vulnerable backgrounds. People who died from homicide, died from suicide, or who may have been treated differently in life based on their group affiliation. Socioeconomic status, occupation, drug addiction, gender identity, race, and immigration status are all kind of layers of individuals who come through our office, and who we have to keep these kinds of community identities in mind as we're analyzing remains and as we're working with families. So a lot of my work has really kind of focused on understanding who people were, not only in death, but also in life, because that's going to help us not only identify them, but also to serve their families well. Because really that's why we're doing this, because we want to serve our communities and we want to assist families. And through my work in Tucson and then continuing into New York City, one of the groups that I've been most focused on and who I've found is the most difficult to identify tends to be undocumented migrants. And these are people who are living on the fringes of society. They're living kind of invisible among us, which unfortunately leads into death. So one of my main goals has been to not only try and identify undocumented migrants through whatever means possible, but also to understand what their physical bodies can attest to their life. And a lot of people are really surprised to hear that the human skeleton records so much of your life history and tells you so much about what you experienced. And when we look at the bodies of undocumented migrants, we do see a lot of physical imprints of trauma or violence or poverty. And I don't mean to say that all undocumented migrants experience the same things. Very diverse group of people. People are coming from different places. They're having different life experiences. But overwhelmingly, what we were seeing is that many of the individuals coming through, particularly through Tucson and dying in the desert, had a lot of physical evidence of poverty. So, a lot of dental cavities, a lot of mouth infections or missing teeth, which is all evidence to us of a lack of dental care. Aside from that, we would be seeing what we call skeletal indicators of stress, which is essentially imprints on the skeleton from childhood that demonstrate chronic malnutrition, lack of access to clean drinking water, lack of access to adequate sanitation. And even when these things happen in childhood, they leave a mark on the skeleton that we can then see in adulthood. So these are kind of all the factors that I consider when I'm looking at an individual and trying to understand not only who they are and how they died, but what their lived experience was. And a lot of this is just trying to not only, return to the community, but also return the stories to the deceased and to their families. So that's very important to me. And that's what I have.
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Angela, for sort of explaining some of the forensic stuff. I think that's helpful for everyone. I'm an associate professor of forensic sciences at a university, and I teach forensic biology and forensic chemistry majors at the undergraduate level. I'm also a forensic anthropology consultant for the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office, doing much of the work that Angela described, and also seeing, unfortunately, those same markers of poverty and chronic malnutrition, in our local communities as well. So examining human remains there, helping with identification. We were going back and also assisting in exhumations and collecting DNA for cold cases and things of that nature. So I'm an associate member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, but then also the human rights delegate for the American Association of Anthropology. And so as part of that work, I help advise the executive board on human rights issues. So a lot of my work focuses on the intersection of human rights and forensic anthropology. Like even now, my little email things popping up with Homeland Security, visa changes, all related to my human rights work with that. One of my main research areas, I like to look at how we can improve our methods and how we can also assist in capacity building in other countries and communities that don't necessarily have access to forensic anthropologists domestically. So I've conducted a lot of work in Uganda as part of a collaborative research team. And we've been going there collectively over the last decade and working with forensic biologists, forensic pathologists, police officers, members of parliament, to try to assist in building forensic capacity, but also understanding how forensics can impact people cross-culturally, especially when you're going into communities and addressing issues with mass graves. That we're going beyond sort of the forensics into the cultural impacts of that type of investigation. I've also done some work in Tennessee on disasters, and I'm interested in seeing sort of where forensic anthropologists aren't when there are human remains to be recovered, and who is doing the recovery, and what that looks like, and impacts of that on communities as well. So I've been looking at, right before COVID hit, there were several tornadoes that went through eastern Tennessee in areas that don't typically get tornadoes, and it was pretty devastating, and they came in the middle of the night. So that's like a whole other story. So looking there and seeing what that disaster response looks like. And then I've also been working with First Nations in Canada as well, with the residential schools, which also have cemeteries and unmarked graves and things. So it's sort of this huge intersection of human rights issues where forensics can be called in, and how do we do that, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't harm communities, right? In a way that actually is helping them and helping them achieve their goals.
So I will jump in to moderate. And before I ask a couple questions that are on my mind after hearing those introductions, and then of course save time for all the questions that are going to be coming from our attendees. I just wanted to create some space for the three of you, who probably haven't all been on a panel together or have intersected, if at all, in very different spaces, to follow up with any questions or thoughts for each other.
I was kind of curious to hear more about, Lucy, your work, because you work on these, mass disasters, and you're trying to coordinate the forensic response with the needs of the families. And I was really hoping to hear where you think those two things align and where there may be conflicts, perhaps, between the forensic kind of investigation and needs and the needs of the families.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So a lot of my focus has been the UK, but of course we never plan for a disaster that just affects our citizens. So all of our UK planning is very outward focused as well. I think I'd reached the point probably shortly before the pandemic where I was being disinvited from as many discussions and meetings as I could possibly manage, because I was really starting to raise some big questions, I think, about that balance. The nature of how a state responds to a disaster and its dead is inherently political, which is stating the obvious in a panel of human rights specialists. But of course, the British, for many years, had assumed that they would be very fair, and we'd solve everything with some fine poetry and a hearty meal. And they were not therefore prone to some of the challenges that we were seeing in war and conflict, and certainly no human rights abuses, and there would be no issues of undocumented migrants here. And those of you who follow me on the terrible Twitter will know that my handle is the disaster wildcard, because I had really started to probe and poke about how we were going to do this and how we weren't going to fall into those traps. And I was with both Adam and Jamie Lee in a fantastic events in the last couple of years. I think it's actually 4 years since we were together. And they really got me thinking, and they got me ready for this. They got me ready for the pandemic, because the way that I have coped with this, which is very anti-British, is to think of ourselves in a civil war, to think of myself as working on a border, to think of myself as working in a conflicted space. They taught me so many lessons about how to do that, because that's not how the British thought they would ever do dead in disaster. But we'd had a number of real close encounters with the same issues that everywhere else in the world was facing. So we'd lost a group of undocumented migrants in a recycling wall collapse, a small number, but it had highlighted just how challenging it was when British processes met with undocumented deceased. Earlier in 2019, we lost a number of, we believe they were fleeing Vietnam, a number of migrants from Vietnam. And all of our British processes kind of creaked and cracked with those sort of challenges. But because I hang out so much with the forensic anthropologists, and because I'm so aware of your intersection with human rights and care of the families, I was ready to ask a lot more difficult questions. Probably my most difficult test, and I speak very carefully about it because it's currently under both inquiry and criminal investigation, was the loss of 72 people in a fire in central London. And really, I feel that was a very, very difficult test of British disaster planning, where in some ways, unfortunately, spending so much time immersed in the radical death movement and learning from you guys has really made me question a lot about our balance there, and has left me with a lot of questions. We had a national forensic anthropology team, for example, here in the UK, that really understood and trained for the balance, but we did not deploy that. We initially made a lot of assumptions about DNA, even though you guys had been teaching me for years that DNA lets some terrible genies out of a bottle. DNA is not the panacea. DNA is a wrecking ball sometimes in the middle of the collection of the deceased. It raises more questions sometimes than it answers. So everything we've been writing theoretically, and unfortunately, I've come back from events or reading your work all inspired, and every time I've created more trouble. And I was awarded a grant to look specifically at whether we were getting our balance right. And I presented that work on the 13th of June 2017, and the fire started 6 hours later. So that has lived with me, really. That was the big challenge for me. At the moment, the community stand by the death toll, and that was important, because obviously in a lot of what you guys had taught me, if the community dispute the death toll, then there are bigger issues to challenge. And of course, it's not my place to get mixing in there challenging questions. It was a very difficult time for anybody who raised questions about the forensic veracity of that process. And so for me, it's been a huge comfort that the community have taken a sort of joint approach with the police and the forensic scientists to get to an endpoint. But I could tell there was one issue brewing, and that is still brewing now, and that is around the memorialization of that site. Because as you guys know, the site is also a grave. And we in Britain, we are a nation of fine hymns and poetry, but we are not a nation of difficult discussions and conversations. We don't know how to articulate death in this way. And we are seeing some very painful, some very obfuscated, some very difficult discussions about the site. And if you're familiar with the Grenfell Tower, you will know that the tower still stands. My learning from everything that I've learned in your field is that that tower will need to come down. And when it does come down, it will need to be treated again as a grave, and a forensic anthropological deployment will be needed. In the current political climate, that is a very unpopular belief. And it's a very difficult one. I think I'd always grown up with family advocacy groups. I've got a book out next year that will explore the early disasters that really shaped me. And I'd always assumed that the family's advocacy just needed amplification. What I'm discovering new, and I'm discovering it with the pandemic as well, is sometimes a government will work very hard to take families with them. And those of you speaking about potential human rights abuses or possibly the lost dead is not a popular voice. The other problem, of course, with disaster management, when it's very codified as it is in the UK, is if you existed in life, you exist in death. If you didn't exist in life, you may not exist in death. And that we have not got our heads around in the UK, and you guys are much more advanced than we are at discussing that. So I'm right in the middle of a bit of a storm with exactly that issue. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I think I would have given you a more kind of hubris-infused answer that said, Britons are good at this, we've had lots of practice, trust in me, I'm infused with family support. Now my position is less clear, I think.
Thank you, Lucy. So I wanted to throw a question out to all of you, and it's something that I know Angela has written about recently with Jared Beatrice, but which I think is part of conversations I've had with each of you, part of, I'm sure, just your daily life. And that's to go back to what Lucy said earlier, that any interaction between the state and the dead is political. And I think we can, of course, also say an interaction between science and the dead is political. So you all work in settings where the politics is unavoidable, and that are also saturated with grief, right? And yet all of you are also called upon, maybe in slightly different ways, but in some way, to be objective scientists, right? Whether it's in the identification of the dead, in how you report that information, or Lucy, I'm imagining in sort of just the endeavor of preparing best practices for, trying to coolly and calmly prepare best practices for events that are at the edge of what we can even think, right? So I'm wondering if you could each tell us more about how you see and also just how you live those, tensions or the kind of, I don't want to say conflicting because I don't want to preload it with the sense that they necessarily do conflict for each of you or for each of you in the same way. But how do you live with the kind of need to apply technical expertise, need to, retain a certain kind of professional objectivity, as well as the kind of inevitable politics and all the affect and emotion that's present in the settings where you work?
I can go. First of all, Adam, I will say that this is a very difficult question because, what is objectivity? I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that, being objective is kind of like being robotic. You have no emotion, you have no connection whatsoever. And, that's just not true because we're human. And you have feelings regardless of how, objective you're being in your casework. So to me, being objective is basically approaching every case the same way, doing data collection the same way, interpreting the same way, still having kind of my own feelings for the deceased and their loved ones. But the important part of it is that you report on all of the findings, basically regardless of what they indicate. And then being consistent with that and how you approach all of your cases is how you approach this idea of objectivity. With that being said, I don't think being objective means keeping your mouth shut just because it's deemed inconvenient for somebody or for some particular group of people. And, pointing out inequalities and pointing out health disparities in certain groups, kind of like the research I'm doing with Dr. Beatrice, I'm not breaking objectivity by pointing these things out because they're there. And if I wasn't to point these things out, I would actually argue that I wasn't being objective because I would be hiding the data. So in my opinion, it has no bearing on how I examine a set of remains, how I approach any single case. And it really, to me, makes no difference on my objectivity to acknowledge racism, to acknowledge sexism, to acknowledge that there's differential treatment to certain groups just because of who they are. I don't see how that has any conflict with objectivity whatsoever because it is what it is. And we can't hide behind this idea of scientific objectivity because it makes some people uncomfortable. So that's my opinion.
To build on what Angela was saying too, is I also think about that process as sort of using that data, but you're also using social science data, right? So you're using the data within your case, but then the data for the context in which you're working. And so whether it's domestically or abroad, I definitely will point out also those patterns, or if something has the potential to be politicized, or if something could be biased because of something going on culturally, or systemic violence playing into it, and looking at that differential treatment. So, and I present it that way too. I talk about it in terms of, what social science research and that aspect of anthropology as well brings to the table. So the context of the cases in which we're working as well. So it goes a little meta, right? Not just the case, but then the context that we're working in, and whether it's an individual or a context more like mass graves, like with the work in Uganda, taking that into consideration as well. And then when it comes to the reporting too, I try to consider reporting all the data, but also when thinking of the wording about who might be using that data and for what purposes, or those findings and for what purposes. So for some of the work that I do, I know that it can be used for policy making potentially, or have been told, like, we're going to look at this for policy making. And so also just being very thoughtful about the language that's used when I report, to make sure that it can't be misconstrued or twisted to be made even more political than it already is, just by its very existence. So that's something else that I consider as well, is who's the audience, even the audience that like I'm not intending to be the audience, and how might that they take that information and use it, and make sure I'm just very clear in what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would agree, obviously, with all of that. Something I'll make sure you've got access to, I'll circulate it, is the New Zealand Disaster Recovery Guidance, which talks about the role of a wild card, whose job it is in immediate aftermath of disaster to point out the bear traps, the things that might not yet be apparent. And it also warns, I'm paraphrasing slightly, that wild card holder will get a bit of a kicking. And certainly that's been my experience. It's all right to sit around the table often and raise groupthink, raise things that other people want to say. It's very, very hard to diverge from that. I think it's particularly hard as a woman to create a voice in these spaces. We're having a big debate, as you guys are as well, but here in the UK, about the type of scientific advice that goes into the Prime Minister and who gets to give that, and lots of issues about the type of science. So our scientific advisory groups are very physical sciences, very male dominated, very white male dominated. Who's giving voice to these things? I'm very pleased that I actually hadn't really engaged with Twitter until the pandemic, because God help me if I'd been on here for other disasters, because sometimes it's like something just possesses my body, and I link to things, and I quote tweet, and I'm discovering all sorts of things. And what you'll find with me is it's usually two particular threads. One is obviously about the care of the deceased, and the other, which is very, very linked in terms of our future and our hope and our recovery and what do we come back to, is often about the needs of children and young people and the vulnerable in the pandemic. And I'm using quite unashamedly my Twitter at the moment to promote things that I've never really said out loud before. And particularly discussions around the fact that excess deaths are not the same as COVID deaths, which is a really, really misunderstood point. I think you guys are having the same battle with this. They're not undiscovered COVID deaths necessarily. They are other deaths. And the reason that was really important, and I'm really pleased actually that lots of journalists and others are starting to cover that discussion, is that when we were planning, we've been planning for years for what's called the excess death work stream in the UK for a pandemic. I have my plan. It's big. You could probably use it to prop up a house. This wasn't new to us, but when we were planning for it, it was a sort of it was another time. You know, the last few years had got a lot harder to plan, and at the start of this year, we were pulled in again to do our planning, and people were building their death plans on the mortality stats of the disease. And that's problematic because A, you're going to lose a lot more people to other causes than the disease, and B, other types of bodies die. And so one of the things that was happening in excess death planning in the local authorities in the UK was they were assuming lots of geriatric deceased from care facilities. But actually what our research had shown from other disease epidemics and other past cases was there would be a large number of other types of non-COVID death. And one of those, very tragically, would be neonatal death and obstetric death. And the UK, like many developed nations, had put a lot of emphasis on being very, very careful to parents, working very closely with paediatric bereavement. And also what I discovered in a lot of my disaster response work was that neonatal bodies are very, very vulnerable in the big mortuary environment. They bluntly get lost. And that had become a really big issue. And when we got the initial plans back at the start of the year, there was so many types of provision that were missing in the disaster mortuaries. No bariatric. which has proved to be incredibly ironic because obviously bariatric consideration, so that's very large bodies, was a concern. No, very little pediatric or neonatal provision. But also the fear of the body was everything in our disaster planning. So we were going back to, shelves up there on AIDS and Ebola that was saying we're overdoing the fear of the actual body here and the contamination. And you know what? And this is the one thing that keeps me going. That and the wonderful panels that I get invited on with you guys is that this has actually not been hard to be heard in. I am much less bruised. Often local-based incidents with very strong police forces. They don't want the chubby British girl. Here, it's been really helpful. People are listening. We've changed course. We've changed practice, and it's been one of my most interesting and fulfilling to advise on. But normally, you're at this point in the response, you're seeing a very haggard me who's very, very beaten down by being told to shush, being told it's an unpopular truth, being told don't raise race. Nobody wants to hear about race in the UK. And also, it's a wonderful fact of British emergency planning that apparently we're not racist at all, so it's not an issue. But this time, we've been heard a lot more. So for me, that was a rare and unexpected positive.
So there's so much more. I know I would love to ask all three of you, but I'm aware of my privilege in already being in contact and having relationships with you and of all the participants who are here waiting. So I'm going to take the other questions I have and just put them in like a little quiver on my back in case space opens up. But otherwise, I think we should go ahead to questions from all the attendees that we have here with us today.
Yeah, we haven't gotten any questions so far yet. So I think attendees, people, if you want to ask questions, I think you can put them in the chat. But there's also a little Q&A feature, I think, in this webinar too that you can use. And maybe you want to move on to another question that you have, Adam, while I'm collecting more questions from the panelists.
Sure. I have an open-ended question that, because this panel is organized as part of the Collective for Radical Death Studies, and I want to invite my students from Duke who are on this call, as well as anyone else for whom this is their first event with CRDS, to certainly go to the website and to our blog to familiarize yourself more with, what that means, radical death studies. But I also think that's an evolving understanding that we get to revisit with every new group of interesting speakers, thinkers, practitioners that we talk to. So I've heard one idea already from Jamie Lee that I think has been, has gradually been heard more and more, but it is still radical for many people. And that's the idea that you mentioned earlier that that recovering bodies and doing forensic anthropology can sometimes do harm to communities. That it's not this unqualified sort of, the scientists come, they give the answers, the uncertainty is resolved, people receive closure. I'm wondering for each of you, what other ideas or truths that you've discovered through your work feel like radical things that need to be heard more in your fields.
I do kind of want to build on what Jamie Lee and Lucy were saying, and most thinking about kind of context and thinking about the needs of a community. And I think that's sometimes where this concept of objectivity gets confused. You really do need to consider the context and the needs of the community and kind of understand the differences between like equality and treating everybody the same, and equity and treating every community based on their needs. And we really do need to consider in our approach to casework that we're understanding each community in their own context and in their own needs, and changing our approach and adapting the way we do things based on that. Historically, in forensic anthropology, there was kind of a box of how we approached cases. and you kind of ticked off all of these different features to create a biological profile, you know, and only recently are we really starting to kind of think outside of that box and think about how to approach cases in this concept of equity. And I'm noticing a comment here from a woman named Patricia who's talking about understanding, you know, biology versus gender identity and the importance of that. And that's kind of something new that we're discussing in the field of forensic anthropology, because historically we've always talked about male or female. You look at the pelvis, you look at the skull, and you determine if somebody is male or female. But we really know that that's so much more complex, and we need to stop approaching our casework in such a black and white way. And there's so many people who are doing like groundbreaking research in this and are getting involved in it. And I'm really excited to see how we can approach casework kind of outside of that box of just male and female. And we start to think about people's different identities and how we can work to not only identify them, but to return their name, their identity to them, and not treat them kind of in the same way that we treat everybody, because they have different needs, and we need to adapt to that.
And adding to that as well, even in the idea of capacity building and working abroad in other contexts as well, the idea that folks with forensic training are also going in and doing what we call ethnographic work, where you interview with communities, you participate, you know, in their rituals and customs and their way of life, and to try to really understand how human remains, as well as the subsequent analysis of them, are going to impact people. Like, for example, with the ethnic group that I've been working with in Uganda, some folks believe that if you're not buried properly, their spirits can haunt you, they can make your crops fail, they can possess you, they can cause other sort of illnesses in the community. And so there's a lot of other things that impact them socially that have to do with the physical human remains. And so to me, and I know others, you know, like in the last 10 to 20 years, have been engaging with communities more and more, like Angela said, to really understand the context and the things that are important to communities. And that's pretty new and, in that sense, radical to forensics, because we have such a long sort of deep history of that black and white approach, and really getting beyond that to understand the context, which I think is great. But yeah, definitely still sort of a burgeoning area as far as forensics goes.
So for me, I think there's some really big challenges ahead. If you've looked at any of my writing, you'll know I was just starting to kind of put into writing things that I've been doing a lot in conferences around the challenges with DNA, and that sort of panacea idea that DNA gets us the answers that we want. One of the big things that I just started to sort of frame up as articles before the pandemic was around a promise that we were seeing, and obviously it's been around for a while, but almost a sort of commercialized promise in a way that we would give bodies back with no other remains commingled with them. And obviously this had been something that forensic anthropology had explored around articulating a set of remains and returning them when it was skeletal, but probably with no over-promising or false promising. But one of the things that I'd become aware of, particularly with things like air disasters, but most increasingly with terrorism, was a promise of what I was calling the clean coffin. So this was the idea of promising families there was neither any DNA of any terrorist or others or a perpetrator, and expanding that definition to include things highly problematically like the airline pilot, but also just the idea of just getting your remains back. And of course, one of the challenges there is that was also quite a Western, highly commercialized, highly resourced phenomenon. and was something that was just starting to be explored in the UK. But the problem that I'd also found with that was that the conversations here, as I've said before, were very British about death. And I think one of the biggest problems we've seen with the honesty and the candor that was needed around the pandemic is Britain, probably similar to many parts of America, is a nation that hides its dead. And the biggest fear in a political optic was the dead in any way spilling out. So dead in a hospital corridor or a mortuary having to show somebody moving the dead. So all of our plans were about hiding our loved ones. And I actually really do believe that the pandemic may be quite a great leveler in terms of conversations here in Britain around life and bodies and death, but also, what we expect and what we fear. When I've noticed in the chat, people saying, how do you get into this, and is it difficult and stigmatized to work with this? It's even in central civil service work streams that were specifically tasked with working on death planning, civil servants have turned around to me and said, that's too much. We can't think about that. We don't want to have those discussions. So this, not just the dead is problematic, but even the discussions around the dead being sequestered. So those are my two big things, really, DNA and actually the dead themselves.
Thank you, everybody. We do have a bunch of questions and comments, and I think Patricia Mitchell has more of a comment than a question. She is really appreciative that Angela talked about biological gender, because there's great harm and violence in misgendering and dead naming a trans body, and the trans experience is very unique, I guess, in life and in death. So there was some appreciation for that. Susanna Riley asked the question, how do you get in the field of death, and is there stigma attached to it? I think we touched upon that already. And why is death considered so radical? And where's that fear, unadulterated fear of death coming from? That's one question. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that and move on after you answer this.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of putting yourself in that position and your loved ones in that position, that we're so afraid to talk about it. But one of the things that I've learned, obviously, in the work that I do, is that death is unavoidable. I don't know that you can ever prepare for it, but I think discussions around it can certainly help. And being in a position where seeing that it's unavoidable has helped make me try and let things go, try not to focus in on things that don't matter, and try and focus on the goodness in life, which can be a little bit difficult at times. But that's a very difficult question to answer, honestly. Does anybody else have a thought on that?
I think there's in my work, the dead are usually, it's usually sudden, unexpected, and highly visually traumatized. So the body is usually very, very damaged by the nature often of, say, a socio-technical explosion, plane crash. And so I think the one of the things that I've been asked a lot with my work is, does it traumatize you? And I always feel a fraud, partly because I'm not a frontline forensic responder. So in some ways I choose my interaction. Does it traumatize or trigger me? And I've really thought very hard about how to answer it, because the other thing I don't want to diminish is people's very strong reactions to being with the dead. And my own experience, which always sounds trite, is that it is only ever been a privilege. But I think possibly that's a kind of evolutionary coping mechanism that part of my brain has developed, but I've never ever seen it in any other way. And I always feel quite affronted when people ask me, how could you look at that, or how could you be there? Because there is, as Angela says, there is nothing more placing it. It absolutely connects you with who you are as a human. And people, I think, at various points in my career have sort of tested and challenged me. They assumed that once I had children, for example, I would find it harder. And I didn't. The work that I find hardest is with the living. The work that I find, for example, because of the way that I work, sometimes I'll get pulled onto other things. For example, planning for, I've done some work around the care of the elderly. And the way that we mistreat our living elderly, often I wish we could translate the care and the attention that I see people like Angela and Jamie Lee give. And I'm an annoying fangirl. I do just watch them work with no use to me at all. But the way that they care for the dead, I wish we could import that to some of the care of our living. The dead have never scared me. It's only the living that scare me. And I think that that's probably my coping mechanism. And I wish we could just be much more honest. And I'm bringing it into family and friends slowly, and I'll get there in the end, that we would have more difficult conversations.
I'm seeing in the chat on the side sort of all these intersecting questions about perceptions of death and is there stigma and what's emotionally comforting or not comforting. And I do think that all these are drawing up a good point in that it varies widely. It does vary across ethnic groups. It varies within a culture group. It varies over time. When I was in a college class as an undergrad, it was traumatic images is what it was called. And the professor started one class asking, who has photos from funerals? And I'm like, and it was me and one other person, and everyone else was like, and it's just something, totally normal in my family, small town, Ohio. I don't know. We took photos at any type of gathering, even if it was a funeral. And that included photos of the body for whose funeral it was. And so it varies really significantly. And so I think for some people, there's different levels of comfort, right? Some things I do in my work, I find extremely uncomfortable and unpleasant. And so that's about me working through, each speaker's talked about their own relationship with death or dead bodies themselves, human remains. And yeah, that's something on an individual level I think we also as practitioners grapple with. People tend to assume I'm super comfortable with the idea of death, and I'm not. I get really anxious. So I'm like, no, I'm not super comfortable with death, but that's something I work through too. So I do think it varies a lot person to person.
Mugabe had a question for Lucy, two questions actually. What would be the benefits of pediatricians involved in death studies, and how does the UK dismissive approach to race-related narratives impact the possibility of having a practical interface with inclusiveness of studies in death narratives?
Yeah, I've brought those up. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we have quite a lot of specialism within our pathology for pediatric pathology, and we have what's called the Association of Anatomical Pathology Technologists. I'll send the link round, which have specific death care guidance for pediatric and neonatal cases. And really that's a great question, because it does sort of sum up my role. I'm a keeper of secrets. I'm a rememberer of things. I have two parts of my brain. One does disasters, one does celebrity gossip. My children don't get a look in. And all I can remember is things about disasters and how to connect people and contact people. So with the pediatric question, all I really do is remind a government planner who perhaps this time last week was planning supply chains for supermarkets and he's been moved on to death planning. I'll say to him, have you got the right pediatric contact? weeks. And literally at the start of February, March, that's what we were doing. And I was working with the consultants that had been brought in by the government and working directly with the government to make sure all of those people were talking. It was a bit late in the game. Ideally, we do it all through the year, all through the time, but obviously you get a lot more attention when the pandemic's actually started. And then I think on the second question, that was about the dismissive approach. Yeah, I mean, that's my biggest challenge really at the moment is trying to get the UK to learn from the discussions in the US. We have an inquiry at the moment going into the fire that I discussed, where the chair and the terms of reference have decided that race will not be an issue at all. And I think some families feel that if it becomes an inquiry about how perhaps race played a part in all aspects of the disaster itself, they lose some focus. For me, it's the next great reckoning in the UK. Will be around our institutional and structural racism, and it will be forced to the front by both our ongoing treatment of migrants. We have our own border issue at the French-English Channel border. We are dealing with huge numbers of usually living migrants, but in some cases deceased migrants there, or refugees. So we will see the issue rise higher and higher, and we won't be able to ignore it anymore. But I saw a tweet this morning from a policymaker that said, you can discuss all sorts of uncomfortable things in Britain at the moment, you just can't talk about race. And until we address that, we will have a continuing problem.
Thank you, Lucy. We have a bunch of questions that touch upon empathy in working with the dead. We have questions about, how do you honor a culture that wants to help that has different ways of embracing death and dying, and how do you, consolidate being, and a scientist, but then also attend to the cultural norms. And the question from Courtney Applewhite in that regard was addressing Jamie Lee Kim's comment about more forensic anthropologists doing ethnographic work in communities. Do you think forensic or medical examiners' offices would benefit from having cultural anthropologists or other specialists on cultures and death on staff or as consultants? Or is it important for the forensic anthropologists or other scientists like forensic pathologists, for example, to do that ethnographic work?
I think that through close collaboration, that's something that could work. I think the idea is just to make sure those components are present, right? And so if you have people, whether they're consultants or a team that's working together, obviously the more familiar you are with the other person's work, the stronger you can be, because you have a deeper understanding and can collaborate in a more effective way. But I don't, out of practicality, I don't know that it always has to be one and the same person, though I would always encourage that kind of cross-training as much as possible. And me personally, I do think, and I think Angela probably could speak to this too, I do think that it would be beneficial to have social scientists more involved in these consulting capacities, whether even domestically or abroad, because there are a lot of issues in communities that, as Angela pointed out, you see in the skeleton, right? You see the markers of the structural violence, the systemic poverty, things like that. And making sure, especially when you're trying to identify someone, that you're connected to the different aspects of a community to make sure that person gets identified, especially when you get into like homeless individuals, drug users. I'm thinking of like more inner city, my experiences with that. So that's for that piece. And then as far as the blending the science with these other cultural practices, as long as the science isn't compromised, right, then there is space for other sorts of cultural practices. But then that also means I personally think there needs to be a recognition that some of the science, there isn't space in those practices for those particular methods. And so then it becomes a question of, well, what can be done in a way that doesn't, traumatize the living community? And then we'll do our best to meet them in that middle space, that it's not all about going in and I've got my list with the tick boxes of all the things that I need to get, and I get that and I leave, but instead seeing, what can I do that's going to benefit them and that they're receptive to, and then working with communities in that way. So I do see space for rituals like what you described in the side chat.
Yeah, I'd actually like to add to that, Jamie Lee. That was very nicely described. A place where this kind of model has worked really well is the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner in Tucson, Arizona, where actually a really good friend of mine, Dr. Robin Reinecke, who is a cultural anthropologist, came into the office via the introduction of a forensic anthropologist, Dr. Bruce Anderson, and she helped kind of create this whole system that not only brought in the cultural context of undocumented migrants who are dying so that we could better identify them, but also brought in the context of the needs of the families. And how, I saw another question in here about, maybe these different cultures and these different folks not accepting an identification. And introducing that cultural context and that knowledge of the needs of the families is how you work with the families so that they understand and they accept kind of the information that went behind the identification. Just approaching a family and saying, oh, DNA, this is your loved one, is not enough. You have to provide all of the information necessary in their own understanding, in their own culture, to believe that DNA identification. Otherwise, all the work that you put into it really doesn't matter. So bringing in a cultural anthropologist into the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner significantly increased the identification rate. I mean, it's incredible how many people they've identified there because of Dr. Reinecke's hard work with Dr. Anderson. And I'm just so impressed by the model that they've created. And I think other offices could learn a lot from that and adapt in the same way.
Thank you, everybody. I know we're at the 11:30 mark and over it already. We do have more questions, however, but I also want to be mindful of everybody's time. I don't know if anyone has 15 more minutes to answer questions or if you have to run. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, then let's move on to the next question. I think there was one in the chat that I don't want to overlook from Francesca Dunn, who said, thank you, Dr. Solo, for what you said about you do to try to maintain objectivity. I'm a Fulbright scholar in the US from the UK doing doctorate in forensic anthropology. And one of the differences I've observed is the general absence use of peer-reviewed and forensic reports in the US, particularly when bias is so unconscious. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the effectiveness or practicality of peer review in forensic anthropological casework.
Well, I personally think peer review is a keystone of how we approach our cases. I think all cases should be peer reviewed. And in every office that I've worked in, casework is peer reviewed. Not only to ensure that you're analyzing the remains and you're getting the same answers, but also to make sure that you're expressing them in a way that people understand. So it's not just your examination, but it's also your interpretation and description. I think I'm not really sure that there's a general absence of peer review for forensic reports in the US. I think for the most part, a lot of people do have their reports peer reviewed. Maybe one of the difficulties might be practitioners who are working independently may not have a system or a process in place. But I think it is 100% the gold standard to have everything peer reviewed, as Francesca mentions. Not only to work towards not biasing your interpretations, but also just to make sure that, you know, we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I would agree and second what Angela said. Peer review is pretty common in my experience as well. I also believe it's vitally important. But again, to Angela's point, I also think though that, and maybe what the participant is getting at, I'm terrible with names, so already I've blanked, is getting at is that, yeah, for independent consultants, maybe there's not like a system or like a pool that you can reach out to. So you'd have to find a peer reviewer on your own. And so it might be worthwhile to, in the field, move into having some sort of resource for that, like a network, basically. I think that's a fair point. But yeah, definitely peer review, for sure.
If I can just come in very quickly, I think if I was doing a quick Google there, because I didn't want to embarrass myself, you will probably be very, very aware, the participant who asked the question, that obviously the UK has had quite a brutal reckoning around peer review in forensic anthropology, and I think we have had to bring in a number of changes, some of which are still under review. It was unusual for forensic anthropology here to be adversarial. We had sort of had a culture of it simply perhaps confirming identity and being quite useful to policing, and then all of a sudden we had some quite distressing and difficult forensic trials. And I would still say in the UK, and I hope the questioner will be studying this area and keeping us all up to date, because I think with the UK, we will continue to see challenges around peer review. One of the things that is a real challenge in the UK is that we are all now commercial, with some exceptions. I am not. Those of us who still have a university contract are not. But many forensic anthropology contracts are now commercial, and they are attached to a lab, and they are essentially private practice. And there's a huge amount of politics around seeking peer review. So one of the difficult things is a little bit like getting your articles peer reviewed as an academic, which is possibly one of the most painful experiences, and I've been pregnant several times, would be that I think the peer review is not perfect, and the UK has done a lot of work around who does it and how, and then of course how a judge and a jury understand it. And we have a number of particular outstanding cases with things like even down to, we've had some criminal cases where people have not been sure whether the bones are human, and it's highly relevant to whether the person charged with murder is found guilty, because theoretically there's no body. So I think it's an area I would really like to see forensic anthropology to continue to stay under the microscope on, really, because it's a real concern.
That peer review process is also what helps us kind of with this concept of objectivity, is you have multiple independent reviewers all agreeing on the same interpretation and analysis, and that brings a lot more weight to the report and the findings. And I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
Okay, the other question is from Valerie Narini. Is anyone on the panel working with aftercare programs, or know of any that work with the resulting disenfranchised grief in order to bridge the gap discussed earlier?
I think in terms of with my work, it's a very long process that does involve a lot of follow-up with the family groups. If that helps at all, and so I think that's a sort of yes from me. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment, because as planners, of course, we're always a few months ahead, is that we're likely to see some very, very distressed families. As I think the world is in shock at the moment. I don't think they've processed what we're losing at the moment and what's happened. So one of the things we actually plan for is to work with disenfranchised family groups. One of my discomforts around that is it can be very forced and very staged. Having seen amazing advocacy and authentic family action groups over the years, what worries me now is a sort of politicized sort of false engagement with families. I ask and hope that families will continue to be very dissenting and activist where needs be, because what we've moved towards in the UK is a model where families are kind of brought in, but find it very hard then to raise difficult questions. So planning for it right now is my answer.
Yeah, I think I have what Lucy said is a sort of tangential, maybe. So with the Acholi in Uganda, my research team, when we've gone to work with communities on how the graves are impacting them and what their perceptions of forensic intervention are, and what methods might be acceptable and things of that nature, when talking to them while there, we found that, long story short, there were some things that we could provide, like site maps of the graves. People who had to keep track of where graves were getting old, and they were worried they were going to die and there'd be no record of them. And so we did do some really basic archaeological surveys for them. And so I don't know that that's helping with the grief, but at least a few people directly expressed it helping with that stress and anxiety of there not being a record of where they were. So there's things like that while working with communities. If there's something that we can provide that will help, we generally try to do that. And then also kind of touching in on what Lucy was saying with planning, with the Tennessee research with the tornadoes, that's one of the things we're looking at is in the aftermath of the tornadoes and the recovery, and like rebuilding basically entire town, like sections of towns, and then COVID hitting, how are people processing that grief, and like how are community resources, what does that look like over time? Because it is a long process. It's not just sort of like an event and then it's done and it's over, but the whole rebuilding is a process as well. So that is something I'm looking into. Yeah.
I can see there's a question about the about viewing the deceased, and that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about building into big, large-scale disaster plans. Disaster plans are overwhelmingly biased towards what the institutions and agencies and police and government want you to get from them, and then somebody like me is trying to always build in the rights of the families and the right to view. It is for the families to decide whether they wish to view. There is some research, I'll make sure I send it to Adam afterwards, on the beneficial aspects of seeing even the most traumatized of remains, and trying to facilitate that. And I think Adam circulated an article that I've written about the dead of the pandemic, and one of my biggest sadnesses is that we have not always been able to facilitate access to the deceased. And my fear is that that will leave us in a very, very heightened state of ambiguous loss. And that will be more terrible than some other side effects of the pandemic. So you'll see me writing about that. But yes, very, very important to me is the right to review both bodies, but also remains, which are, of course, different in a way and require very different settings, for example. And in the UK, the police have become quite resistant to that because it's an emotional labour, it's a workload. So when we were talking before about what sort of things does a wild card raise, it's things like that.
I know we're not beyond out of time, and I'm so thankful to everyone for keeping this discussion going. There's a question in the Q&A that I thought somebody might want to address, from Areli Cruz Santiago, whose work I'm very familiar with as somebody who's accompanied and written about the disappeared in Mexico, and has been involved in elaborating the notion of citizen forensics from below that don't have access or support from the state or other authorities. She asks, can the panelists give an example of spaces where the science gets compromised, when involving families or cultural contexts in investigations. And I think she pushes a little bit on some things that have been said earlier, saying, isn't the idea of the science being compromised another reification of purity and objectivity in science? So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that question.
Jamie Lee, we're duking it out. This is a very tricky question. My thought is, what is the purpose of the forensic investigation, and how might involving families and appearing as an activist compromise the purpose? A lot of the things that we've been talking about are identification and reunification of loved ones. We haven't really been talking about human rights violations and gathering evidence to prosecute a perpetrator. And these are two different things. When you are talking about gathering data that will then be taken to court to prosecute, a government, you 100% have to be a lot more thoughtful in your objectivity, because you don't want to compromise basically what you're there for. So in that sense, I think involving families in the identification and reunification process is one thing, but then interpreting the trauma and reporting on what those findings might mean needs to be something entirely separate, because you never want to be called into question about whether your findings are just trying to push a specific narrative as opposed to your findings just standing for exactly what they are. In a lot of, in medical examiners' offices, a lot of this is done based on separation of the science and the investigation. So, a medical examiner's office is not under the law enforcement branch. It's actually under the Department of Health, so that we can maintain the separation between our scientific interpretation of the trauma and whatever it is law enforcement is doing to investigate the perpetrator themselves. So that's one way you kind of keep that separation and that clear objectivity. But as I said, that's completely different than the identification that we've been kind of discussing previously.
And I would agree with the notion too that I also would pose that question of, well, what would one mean by compromising science, even though I know I said it, but I would also pose that question because also, in working in other geographic regions, if we can also look at it from the practice of science, it's done differently in different places. And standards are, if they're there, they're often dictated by the medical legal system, even though the actual lab might be separate from it, that we're still looking at what are the expectations of the court, what are things that they consider valid evidence. And you can see this in international courts, you can see this, domestically and abroad, but that's going to directly influence how we apply the science and what kinds of questions we're asking. If you look at forensic biology work, even the settings on the equipment might vary based on access to different supplies and resources that people have. And so then how might that influence the results? What sample are they using for comparison? And how might that influence results? And so, science is definitely flexible and not this sort of rigid framework that we often try to put it in, at least with a sort of westernized approach, very positivist thinking. So I think a better way of putting it would be we want to make sure we can get the evidence that's necessary to satisfy whatever legal system we're in, as long as that doesn't harm the communities. And then to what Angela was saying, that when we present it, the presentation is going to be very different in that legal arena than it would be with a community as well. Really good question.
All right. How are we doing in time? Do we want to do one more question? Okay, one more, and then we have to call it. Thank you for the work you do for Molly. What surprised or surprises you most when trying to collaborate, form bridges, or communicate with multiple stakeholders with different, even conflicting interests? I thought it was an interesting question.
I'll go first. I think that the dead are not always seen as important. I remember Jamie Lee presenting on her research to me a few years ago and talking about Uganda and the importance with which communities place on their dead and their resting dead. And we'd lost some of that narrative in the UK. And one of the difficulties for me is the care of the tower and the grave and the bereaved and the dead bodies of that tower in the centre of London are all, but the other stakeholders find that very hard to believe. They weren't listening to Jamie Lee. They weren't listening to Adam. They believe it's about other things. They believe that the bereaved are unsettled about other things. They put in mental health support to try and make the problem in their head go away, when I know and you know it's about the resting and the right to rest of those remains. So my problem often is that I sound a bit mad. And the other stakeholders have very different agendas, and they have not yet walked the path that those bereaved have walked, and they haven't spent time with death scholars like you. And I can't replicate that. So it's very, very difficult.
I find this to be an interesting question, and I can see where Molly's coming from. I know she does work identifying undocumented migrants, and in order to be effective in that, you really do have to collaborate with stakeholders that you may not necessarily agree with. Dr. Kate Bird and soon-to-be Dr. Justin Myers wrote a really good chapter in the book, The Sociopolitics of Migrant Death, where they're basically talking about the importance of trying to collaborate with multiple stakeholders and compromise in a way in order to be able to achieve the ultimate goal of identifying that individual and returning them to their loved ones. So you're collaborating with nonprofits who have a very large advocacy agenda, as well as collaborating with law enforcement and collaborating with Border Patrol. But as long as everyone has the same ultimate goal, and you're very careful how you navigate those relationships, you never want it to be compromising to the person that you're trying to help. But I think as long as you navigate those things carefully, as you know, Kate and Justin were saying, you can be effective, and ultimately what you want to do is serve that family and that community. It can be frustrating and it can be difficult, but I think it's actually important.
And also, the dynamics can change a lot throughout the whole process. So you can hit points where it's really not effective, and then it's a matter of sort of regrouping and figuring out how to translate the needs of the different stakeholders to each other, like helping facilitate that as much as possible, because we are in a position where we are directly working with the different stakeholders who don't always directly work with each other. And so that's another thing to consider. But yeah, definitely can be very difficult and very frustrating, trying to find that middle ground and make sure everyone understands the needs of each other.
All right, I think we have to wrap it up for today. Jamie Lee, Angela, and Lucy, thank you so much for taking time out, of your very busy schedule. We learned a lot today. It was a very rich discussion. I know I learned a lot. I know we didn't come to everybody's question, but I think we probably touched upon everybody's, questions and ideas. And Adam, do you have any last words?
My last words would be to second the thank yous to the panelists who've been generous with their time and really deep thinking. To thank my wonderful, thoughtful co-moderator, Tamara, and the Collective for Radical Death Studies for letting us come together in this way. And finally, last but not least, everybody who attended for just these unbelievably thoughtful questions. It's been a huge privilege. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.